All right. So this is, as you know, an open-ended interview. It's an occasion to talk at length about whatever seems vaguely relevant to our very open-ended topic of how people come up with ideas for research and how that kind of preliminary or exploratory process works before you've kind of finalized what your theory, hypothesis, and research design is.
Mm-hmm.
So it's everything that happens before that moment. And so, unlike a standard, maybe a standard interview where we would focus on the content of your work, what I'm really trying to get at here is how did you come up with the ideas for your work? Of course, that necessarily involves some discussion of the content as well, but that will be somewhat secondary. And I do have a kind of a schedule of questions to ask, but you should feel free to dilate in any direction you wish, and we're not restricted for time. I've done several of these so far, and they tend to last somewhere between a half hour and an hour. So,
Okay.
really depends on you. And I'm going to try to stay in the background. Normally, I would interject with lots of hms and okays, and that's great, but because we're planning to, to publish these as a podcast, I have to be mindful and keep quiet. So don't interpret that as a lack of enthusiasm.
Okay.
All right. So my first question is about your general approach, and you made reference to this in your email, actually, but perhaps you could just repeat that. Is there a typical approach that you follow when identifying topics for research?
There's not a conscious typical approach. I can think back and sort of reconstruct what was going on in my mind. I guess there are a couple of patterns I can identify. One is that when you're working on a given paper that's part of a research agenda that's situated in kind of open turf area where you're doing something substantially different than what someone else has been doing, then you want to sort of spread out the turf and make it an important body of research. And that's the easiest way to come up with research questions, is just to do an area where there isn't a lot of research, and you think of new stuff while you're working on something in a concentrated way.
Mm-hmm. Can you give some examples from your work of how that actually plays out?
The best example of my own research would be the work that I did, the collaborative work I did with Tom Gilligan early in my career, where we transported from economics games with incomplete information. And we did a series of, I think, 4 papers that were pretty much purely theoretical. And they were not very accessible either, because they're complicated models, and there is a kind of model that wasn't very well known at the time. It was just sort of warming up in economics, and it was unknown in political science. With one exception, a paper by David Austin Smith and Bill Riker, which was also a very complicated paper, and I think not widely understood. So after Tom and I did a sequence of these papers, within that sequence, one led to the other just very naturally. Like, we published the first one and gave it at a conference at Columbia, and Mo Fiorina said, "There are 2 things I don't like about this model. One is that committees aren't heterogeneous, whereas they are in Congress. And 2 is," what was number 2? Oh yeah, two is that we had the model structured such that the committee could, the floor rather, could commit to a closed rule, whereas in the real world the sequencing is such that it could easily renege. So that actually became our next 2 papers, is one where we added an additional committee member to make the committee heterogeneous. That is, like to have a Republican on one side and a Democrat on the other side of a pivotal voter. And the other paper we wrote changed the order such that it addressed Mo's other gap. So that's a nice case in which there was a natural progression of papers, 3 in this case, that were stimulated by criticism at a conference.
Right, right. So if I could maybe paraphrase broadly, you came to an area, Congress, where formal theories hadn't been widely applied,
Where
and you
formal theories
found.
of this specific type, um,
Sorry.
where not formal theories in general, but this specific type,
Okay. Right. Right.
games with incomplete information.
Okay. And so the field was, in some sense, wide open, and your first work sort of mapped out that field, and subsequent work came in response to various critiques or whatever, and by way of extending the earlier work. Is that a fair characterization?
Right. So the set of models collectively had quite a bit of coverage,
Mm-hmm.
whereas individually they're easily criticizable for making assumptions that were too simple.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And is well, I don't know if this is going too far back in time, but how did you become a Congress specialist?
Um, uh, I was in graduate school at the University of Rochester, and it's really kind of miraculous that I became a Congress specialist because I never took a class in Congress in my undergraduate training or in my master's training at the University of Kansas or in my PhD training at Rochester. But because Dick Fenno, who was my advisor ultimately, was he had regular offers from Harvard in those days that he was entertaining, and as he was entertaining them, Rochester was trying to retain him by cutting his course load, so he didn't teach for a few years, and I never had the benefit of learning from him in the classroom. But after I passed my qualifying exams, I took qualifying exams in methods, in formal theory, and in electoral politics. And I didn't much like electoral politics, but I liked American politics. So I thought, well, maybe I'd like institutions more. So I started reading on Congress, and I just really got into it and spent a summer reading, Dodd and Oppenheimer and books like that, and then following up on the research that I liked in Dodd and Oppenheimer. And I just really got excited about the topic. So when Fenno was passing through, he was working on his Senate books at the time on John Glenn and Dan Quayle and Arlen Specter and so on. He met me, and I just loved the guy instantly, and he was so kind and so high powered, bang for the buck. I mean, I've never been in anybody's office where you get so much useful information per minute as you did with Dick Fenno. So I asked him if he would be my advisor, and he was, and it worked out really well. It was kind of interesting. I didn't meet with him very much at all throughout my research and writing phase, but when I did, again, I got so much out of him in so little time. It turned out to be a great working relationship.
It may not be completely beside the point to ask you a little bit about how that worked, since I think of Fenno's work as being sort of the opposite of your work, even though ostensibly you're working on the same institution. But obviously he was providing something that was really important to your work.
Yeah, I mean, the great thing about Dick is the same as the great thing about Bill Riker, is that they have their thing and they have their way of doing work, but they have a huge amount of respect for doing things the other way as well. And the reason I got along with Dick so well was that although I did formal theory in graduate school, it was really lowbrow formal theory. It was very accessible. And I think I learned, I don't know how I learned really, but somehow or other I got a sort of aptitude for communicating complicated ideas in a simple way that Fenno respected. And, Fenno thought that the field needed people like me, and my role model in graduate school was probably Mo Fiorina more than anyone else. He was also a Rochester graduate student
Mm-hmm.
who worked under Fenno and did a little bit of formal theory.
Mm-hmm.
And but to answer your question more directly, it was the open-mindedness and high level of respect that Dick had for different kinds of research on Congress.
Mm-hmm.
He viewed Congress as an institution that could be studied fruitfully in many different ways, and he was supportive of really anybody who was doing. He could find good in any paper. So
Yeah,
including like anthropology and sociology of a very traditional form. The kind of stuff that most Rochester graduate students rebel against,
right?
Because it's not rigorous or it's not scientific.
Right. Well, that's interesting. I had an advisor in graduate school, Mike Rogan, who maybe in that respect was similar. He had a capacity to think things through from the student's perspective, which is rare, because normally what you get is, well, if I were doing this, this is what I would do.
Yeah.
Anyway, let me ask you a little bit about your books, because you've written 2 books that I'm aware of that have had a big impact on the field. And, just judging by Google Sites, the Information and Legislative Organization and Pivotal Politics. And I would like to know a little bit more about how you came about the decision to write those books, how they came together, and so forth.
The histories of those 2 projects are really quite a bit the same. I mentioned earlier that in information and the example of where I get ideas. One way I get ideas is from working on a current paper in a relatively undertilled field of turf, if you want to think of it that way. After Tom and I did a series of theory papers, I was of the impression that, theorists liked and respected the work, I think, but what I really viewed as my constituency was congressional scholars and students of American politics. And I thought the only way I could get their attention and get them to consider seriously these theories that had, crazy notions of signaling and stuff that most political scientists weren't familiar with. The only way I could reach that audience would be to do empirical work jointly with the theoretical work. And I made the decision to not put the theory in the book because, number one, it was already published, and number two, I thought it would alienate readers. So the key to the success of the book, I think, was an experiment, and the experiment was just to see whether the core ideas of 2 big sets of formal theory literature, the literature on log rolling and distributive politics, pioneered by Ken Shepsley and Barry Weingast and others, Caltech, whether that kind of theory and the other stuff that Tom and I did, what I called informational theory in the book, whether those could be tested empirically. Well, I actually jumped ahead. The first thing I wanted to say was whether they could be communicated informally, whether I could get across the main ideas, the main insights of the mathematical models in a almost strictly verbal way. I mean, there are some symbols and figures, but it's mostly a verbal presentation of these 2 classes of theory. And I circulated the drafts just to a minimal number of people because I wasn't really comfortable with it. kind of casual writing style. And I got good feedback, so I went ahead with the project. And I had been collecting data for some time anyway, but wasn't quite sure what I would do with it. And when I got into the data set with the theory in mind, and sort of reduced to, or distilled to a handful of manageable hypotheses, things really started to fall together, and it sort of felt like it could be a book, and so I plugged on and finished it up.
Mm-hmm. Sorry.
No, that's
okay.
it.
Well, let me question you on a point that is, let's say, confusing to me and probably to others of my ilk. I'm an inductivist. I tend to get my hands dirty with the data and then eventually come up with a theory to explain it. So how does it work when you're approaching things from the other angle? When you've got a fairly clearly...
It works.
Yeah, go ahead.
It works well sometimes, but I think it's really very topic specific. I don't have a philosophy that that's the way you do social science research. I don't think it's necessary to theorize first and test second. And it's really deceptive to even characterize work that way to some extent, because when you do formal models, you make assumptions, and your formal model isn't going to be any good if your assumptions aren't at least somewhat empirically informed. So you construct a model to solve a real world problem. It's going to have components and ingredients that are drawn from the real world. So there is no such thing as pure deductive theory. So we're just talking about central tendencies. Right. And in the case of information and legislative organization, and likewise pivotal politics later, I had, in the first case, a set of complicated, complex, new and foreign models to work from. In the second case, I had just one very simple, easy to understand model, which I called the pivotal politics model, that there wasn't as much of a need to sell people on its uniqueness or importance. I think it was regarded as unique, at least from the start. But I thought it would be a more complete research agenda to do empirical work on that. So that's what I did.
Mm-hmm. So from your perspective, does your approach seem, I'm getting back to what you phrased, I think quite appropriately, as different central tendencies. Does your approach seem quite different from congressional scholars who, begin with the data, run their regression models, and then develop a theory?
I think it is. I think it is different because in the traditional, you call it traditional, and the way you summarized it, the theory is usually not as transparent as research. I call this bridge building research, where you build a bridge between the theory and the data. In traditional research, the sort of bottom-up inductive research, you typically don't know exactly what the theory says or means, because concepts are typically not defined formally ex post, and the line between what's an assumption and what's a derivation is blurred. And when you do explicit formal models, you have to make those distinctions sharply to communicate exactly what the argument is. And I'm not saying that people can't do good inductive research that has theoretical content, but I'm saying that as an empirical matter, most people who do research that way don't end up with what I consider a tight and complete argument that is you know, if you've done the job well, you should be able to say this prediction isn't borne out. It ought to be traceable to some assumption that doesn't have merit for whatever reason, and you trace it back up to the probable cause of the prediction being wrong or being refuted, and you know that that's where additional work needs to be done, that you need to characterize the model somewhat differently by including a veto player or considering the fact that a certain stage is likely to be supermajoritarian rather than simple majoritarian or what have you. So the traceability of problems and the sort of repair of an argument is easier when the model is explicit.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's a natural affinity between formal models and the process of pre-registering studies prior to their implementation?
Boy, that's a question I haven't thought about. This is completely off the cuff, but that is a plausible claim, because in both cases you're investing something. You're incurring a risk of wasting your time on a bad idea. A theorist who don't know how to articulate this. The question is whether pre-registration is analogous to modeling first and testing second.
Right. Yeah, it's beside I guess not directly in line with what we should be talking about with respect to this book, but it's an intriguing question.
Well, it is interesting, and I don't mind pursuing it just off the cuff. I can see where you write down a model and you publish it. You're in some sense pre-registering your idea, but the thing is that there aren't that many people in political science who would then go on and do an empirical test on the theory.
It is interesting, isn't it, that the move towards pre-registration has come out of the experimental camp, and the experimental camp is not terrifically formal in their orientation, at least most of the people I know.
Well, I think, it depends on what you mean by formal. I mean, they're capable of and often do utter precise propositions and specify rigorously conditions under which they would accept or reject the hypothesis. But they're not formal in the sense of stating assumptions and driving propositions. They're not formal modelers in the usual political science sense.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is something for further thought. I'm going to take a different tack here. Do you have the feeling that the work that you do is related in some way to your personal biography? Does it resonate with your life, or is it more of a intellectual endeavor, let's say?
Aside from the fact that I spent a year or most of the year on Capitol Hill about almost 30 years ago, the answer is just basically a no. I mean, I've always liked politics. One of my earliest political events was when I was 5. I had a babysitter. Both my parents were teachers, and it was before I went to kindergarten. They would drop me off at this babysitter's house, and the Kennedy. It was 1960, and Kennedy was running against Lincoln, and the guy the father of the house where I was staying said, "Well, I'd never vote for Kennedy because he's a Catholic," and I thought, "Boy, that's messed up." And, we got into an
Oh my
argument, and I was
goodness.
5 years old. I've
Yeah.
always liked politics. Um, and I remember in 64, 68, my mom let me gather. We had a main TV in our living room, and we had a couple of little black and white sets in the kitchen or bedroom or something. She let me put all of the TVs together and watch the convention simultaneously on 3 networks.
Like you're at a newsroom or something, right?
So yeah, but I don't do political science because my parents were
Right.
politicians or anything like that.
Right. Well, I guess some people feel very connected to their subject and to their arguments
Yeah.
and to their, kind of they see. Well, actually, this is related to another question. Do you see your work having an impact on society, beyond political science?
Um, I don't often think of that, but when I do think of that, I think I doubt it. Um, I think if so, it's so indirect that there'd be noise about a lot of noise
Hmm.
about any claim that it had an indirect effect. I mean, I think uh, I guess I draw a parallel, and this sort of sounds like a um, self-aggrandizing statement. So I want to qualify and say this is a very rough parallel. If suppose you asked Anthony Downs that question instead of me, I don't think Anthony Downs had an immediate impact on how politics is conducted and practiced. But I think his notion of looking at electoral competition in a spatial way along a sort of ideological dimension has affected the way journalists cover politics and the way, even more indirectly, the way some people think about it. Because, notions like the left and the right have gotten in the nomenclature and are used quite regularly. And I think a, a possible example of something like that would be um, the effect of the pivotal politics model on heightening people's sensitivity to the filibuster and the fact that some bills need 60 votes effectively rather than 50 or 51. Um, and Also, well, I don't want to push it that far. I was going to say alert them to the sort of dubiousness with which the Senate recently treats its procedures by, invoking the nuclear option
Right.
at opportune times and doing the same thing with
Yeah.
reconciliation.
Yeah. I was thinking as you were talking that it is rather complicated to try to trace the impact of political science, given the fact that, I suppose what we write is read by other political scientists. And it does end up, on syllabi and in class lectures and so forth. And a huge number of people who enter public life in the US get a political science degree or at least take a political science class. So you have to imagine there's some diffuse effects going on.
Yeah, I think when I was answering the question earlier, I had in mind, are there people out there real people, not students, but
Right.
um, citizens, do these citizens benefit from the publication of pivotal politics? I mean, that's got to be a no. But they might bear some consequences through journalists who find it to be a compelling way of making a first pass at what
Hmm.
conflict is going to be like in
And,
various settings.
so a related question is when you're writing a paper that is going to be read by a subset of political scientists primarily. Is your what's driving you? Is it a sense that, oh, this issue is just not well understood and we need to make some progress here, or what's the bee in your bonnet? I guess is my question.
Um, there's the answer to that sort of depends upon the phase of my career. Early in my career, I just liked doing research. I mean, I just loved going to work in the morning and diving into whatever I was working on at the time. And things happened fast, and it was fun. I loved collaborating. I had great colleagues. I was at Caltech at the time. That's where I started. I just thought I had the greatest job in the world. When so you go a couple of decades and things are great, and then your administrative load picks up, and you get to be a little bit more selective in the projects you work on, and you diversify a bit, and then there's sort of, for me, there was variable responses to different papers. Some I thought, yeah, this is good, it's different, it's important, and it was like the old days. But others are a little bit flat, and you don't know whether they're going to pan out. And they usually pan out and are publishable, but you don't feel great about them because you didn't nail it or something. You made a contribution, but it's not going to be anything people will be talking about 10 years from now. And late in my career, which I characterize as now, I'm much more selective about what I work on, and what I work on is much different than anything I've done before, simply because I think there wouldn't be much point in me re-entering the congressional field because, well, I don't know why. It's not that I don't like it anymore, but I would just rather do something new and different.
So is it as you grow older and is it a question of just finding new things to work on, or a different type of work that you're looking for now?
It will be. I mean, if what I'm doing now works, it will be both. I'm studying the history of political institutional development, and I'm doing it by reading broadly in terms of legislative bodies, city councils, and the most idiosyncratic example is papal voting, and that's the project that I'm most involved in now. And this is a really high risk venture because, number one, I don't know much about Catholicism, but I do know something about elections and collective choice. And there's a lot of fascinating stuff that has happened over the millennia in papal voting. But I mean, you talk about inductivism. This is as inductive as it gets because I don't have any theoretical priors to speak of. But
is the kind of the research question whether there are some similarities in organizational development across very different types of institutions?
Yes, that's the broad research question. The research question for the papal voting is: are there patterns in the way College of Cardinals makes its decision about how to vote? So from year to year, there's just what appears to be totally ad hoc variation in whether they use a 2/3 majority rule or whether they use unanimity or whether they in effect do both, but fake the unanimity by referring to some crazy doctrine. It's almost comical to read. And so while I'm trying to decide how to code this and document trends, if any, I'm just getting a good feel for the sort of divergent ways or diversity of ways that people can engage in collective choice.
And stepping back from this for a moment, how did you get this idea to look at institutional developments and to look at the Go ahead.
Well, I have, given my work in Congress, I've thought a long time about the simple question of, not the simple question, well, it's simple to state, but it's hard to answer. What is an institution? And it's a topic I take on every year in my PhD class. And I find that my view of what is an institution literally changes from year to year. And I would like to be able to write a sharp argument about where and why the question even matters, and have such an essay conclude in a statement of how we should think about, if not institutions, at least some substantive counterpart with a different name.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the overarching theme. The narrower theme with regard to the papal voting is, how do different actors across institutions exploit the sort of omnipresent phenomenon that rules are endogenous, and that if they don't like the way they're going about making decisions, usually in most organizations, you can change the way you go about making decisions. And I originally started I had a hypothesis when I started this project, which was that there would be a long-term historical trend across a lot of institutions, legislative and non-legislative, towards simple majoritarianism. And I knew, for example, that the papal voting and some elements of Greek voting in Athens were unanimous. So I just sort of coded the early data point as unanimity, and then saw histories like the British Parliament, where, I don't know, in the 1400s or thereabouts, it looked like the House of Commons started using the supermajority, and the papal voting had the same tendency. And it seemed to me that in a more micro level, the Congress was becoming less supermajoritarian, especially the Senate. This is about the time Reed invoked the nuclear option. For example.
Are you familiar?
But the more I read, the more I saw that was just totally not wrong. That there's both time series variation within most institutions in what decision rule they use, and there isn't a common pattern across institutions.
Are you familiar with this anecdote that Schatzschneider relates? I think it's in his Party Government book. He talks about the Boy Scout troop. If I'm remembering it correctly, they.
I think I read this.
My memory may be faulty, but what I recall is, there's a there's a vote for whoever's going to be Scout leader, and it's a secret ballot. And in the first round, there's no winner because every boy votes for himself. But you can imagine that they're, they do several iterations, and that, if I'm remembering correctly, they end up with, what you would predict. And
what you would predict. Is that what you said?
Well, I think Schatzschneider's heading towards what you're heading towards, which is, what's going on here. Well, we want to monopolize some goodie that I guess the leader of the Scout troop is able to provide. And so to do that, you have to form coalitions with people. You have to talk to them, get them to vote for one person, coalesce, all of that activity that would seem to be a kind of an illustration of what you're looking at.
Yeah, that sounds like the papal voting situation sometimes. I mean, what they do is they keep throwing up candidates, and I mean, this is in the era that I was reading about yesterday. They throw up candidates, and they they reject them if they don't get above sometimes a supermajority and sometimes a simple majority. And there's no explicit record of why they use a supermajority sometimes and why they use a simple majority sometimes. A conjecture would be that when there are a lot of factions, you might just lower the bar. But there's I don't know of any way to measure that. But the really crazy thing, which first got me sucked into this, is that there's this doctrine called mare pars et sanior pars, and it's a Latin phrase, the translation of which is roughly the greater number and the greater wisdom. And what they do is they say that if you have more than a majority, it's obviously the case that the ones in the minority are wrong. They're not bad people, they're just wrong. So the majority is the greater numbers is also the wiser. So we just accept that, a minority is wrong, and they accede to the majority preference, and therefore the decision is unanimous, and we're complying with our rules. Which is just kind of a charming way of getting a maximum size coalition.
Building consensus. Yeah. Huh. Well, let me turn the discussion again to a slightly different question. When you're advising graduate students who are, let's say, struggling for a topic to write their dissertation on, or maybe they're your colleagues or junior colleagues or former students who are struggling to find their feet to identify a fruitful topic, is there some advice that you are able to offer?
Not very. I mean, one thing is I'm blessed at having outstanding graduate students who are usually pretty self-sufficient and interested in. They know what they're interested in, and the problem is not in having them find a topic. The problem is in it being a topic that I know enough about to be a useful advisor on. Our PhD program here in the business school is small. So I do a lot of advising because there are a lot of students to advise. But I don't have any standard, here's how you find a topic advice, other than the obvious, which is to read what you're interested in, and whatever floats your boat and you think you can study.
Well,
think about it and bring me a plan, and I'll react
in looking at our colleagues, do you have the feeling that some are just more creative than others? Some are managing to identify those really fruitful topics again and again, and others not so much. Is there any secret to this? Is there any secret sauce?
I don't think there's a secret sauce, but the direct answer to your question is yes. There's a lot of variation in people's creativity, and I don't know how you can teach creativity.
Mm-hmm.
I'm clueless about that. I mean, other than a fairly obvious point, which is to exercise your freedom and don't wear blinders.
Do you feel that? Are there blinders that you see many people kind of stuck in a rut?
Some people have a tendency to let the literature define their interest, and they work on narrow, tweaky type topics. And there's a place for that. I mean, that's normal science, and knowledge is accumulated that way. But the best students who turn out to be the best researchers in their careers define their own questions based on what they think is interesting. That is, they're not I'm not saying they ignore the literature, but they bite off a big enough
Mm-hmm.
problem that they can sort of count it as their own
You know,
problem.
I like what you
Um,
said about your current research, where you took a concept that is ubiquitous and you stood back and you said, "Well, but what does it mean, really?" You know, opening up that box, right?
yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm gonna open the box and try to nail it. Um, but I've in effect been doing that my whole career. Um, and I have a few ideas and new twists to keep myself going and think that it might pay off. But I'm also a realist in that I think it's possible that I'm over the hill and it won't work. Or it, but that's okay. I have tenure and I'll
Yeah,
finish out my
but I
career.
think
Um,
we need to have courage, right? We need to take those risks, and that is what tenure is supposed to be about. And unfortunately, my sense is that the tenure thing comes right at a point in life when I guess the literature on creativity says we're less likely to come up with really interesting ideas.
yeah, I'm not surprised to hear that. I mean, I've observed a lot of variation in how people respond to tenure. In my case, I don't think it affected me a bit. Um, I, 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 I don't think you'd find any. You do an interrupted time series on my Vita or something, and it would you wouldn't find anything.
Right.
Um, well,
So let's see. Well, I really only have one more question, and this is my catch-all residual question of what are we missing? You know, having talked for an hour and you're having taken the standardized survey, are there other aspects of finding topics, exploratory research that you think you know deserve attention?
I don't have any broad advice. Um, no, I think anything I would say would be insipid and something that you've heard a million times. Um, I mean, when I supervise Congress scholars, I say read Congressional Quarterly or National Journal or The Hill or something. Stay in touch with reality because most of my students, given the nature of our program, are formally very well trained, um, and if they do applied research, I emphasize to them the importance of knowing, ground level facts about what they're studying.
Well, it's
But
pretty
that's not,
important.
that's hardly deep or
And you're a
profound.
long way from DC out there in California. Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Keith. I
Yeah,
really appreciate it. And why don't you just let me know about whether you want that section to come out in the published version? I really appreciate it.